The next area in need of improving may be how we deal with disability in medicine and in the larger society. Presently, we provide palliative care with the aid of plastic or metal prosthetics, crutches, braille, sign language, wheelchairs, and an almost ubiquitous accessibility culture. This does not heal the disability, but only covers it or attempts to ameliorate or assuage the negative externalities associated with a disability. The right idea is to entirely heal and restore limbs, eyesight, speech, hearing, as we witness such restoration through the acts of prophets like Elijah, Elisha, Jesus Christ, Moses, and Muhammad. They would have limbs regrown. They would entirely heal the eyes and renew the very tissues of the eardrums. And they would do it without surgery, without harming the patient. This is truly in accord with the Hippocratic oath of reforming without doing harm. So the question we may ask next is this: if we can so cure and end disability, why don't we do so? Let's go over a little background on disability throughout history. Some use disability since ancient times as a way of controlling, manipulating, and incarcerating a peoples. This is because disabled and diseased peoples are in a prison where their abilities are limited due to their disability or poor health, rendering their bodies as a prison. In a capability-based economic model, the disabled are impoverished due to diminished organic capability, only remedied by relying on external aids like crutches, for example, unless we entirely heal and restore their bodies. Because the disabled are in a way imprisoned, it is perhaps for these reasons some folk were so upset with healers like Jesus Christ for healing the disabled, because as they saw him healing the disabled, they equated the act of healing to a jailbreak. Now, ancient idolatrous techniques involve disabling people, and this is a very ancient technique denounced by the prophets, and even though Jesus Christ himself condemns any form of race harm or harm with the intent to disable or disease, and he even set an example of healing people. Unfortunately, one too many people today do not believe in healing peoples unconditionally. What do we mean by healing people unconditionally? Jesus Christ and the prophets set an example of healing people unconditionally. They would heal people who were complete strangers without asking them for permission, without asking them for consent, without asking them to believe in God or their religion, without asking them to convert to a certain faith. Jesus himself healed and set an example for his apostles. And this exhortation to heal is in the Bible. But even as the Pope acknowledges, people today may lack the generosity to implement curative management techniques and prefer to use palliative management techniques instead. This, of course, does not serve society, because the disabled are a greater burden on the opponents than if they were dead, because it gladdens the hearts of the worst enemies of a nation. Recall that in warfare, the unscrupulous opposing sides do not want to murder the opponent's soldiers, but they merely want to cripple their opponents or their enemies so as to make the crippled a burden upon society, thereby encumbering their enemies with years of taking care of the disabled, as opposed to if they murdered their enemies, they would simply be rid of their enemies, but so would the opposing society. Now let us look at the root causes behind the scourge of disability and some hurdles and solutions. The question we may ask is this: if we can regrow limbs without using prosthetics, and if we can restore sight to the blind and put an end to the use of Braille and sign language, and if we can have a world without wheelchairs and ramps, why don't we do this already? To answer this question, we may review the root causes of why some people insist on having disabled folk and disabling folk. Historically, people who misbehave have been injured or disabled. This is a way of discouraging undesirable behavior. Now, one too many viewers may mistakenly think that the root cause is human misbehavior, but the root causes are flaws in the system which cause an individual to misbehave. Unfortunately, people who are not the greatest fit for management, clergy, and leadership positions are most likely to put the burden of leadership onto others, and they're most likely to blame their victims, all the while touting personal responsibility, agency, and freedom, when in fact they are misusing and misdefining personal responsibility, agency, and freedom. As managers and leaders, your task is to create a wholesome and safe environment where undesirable thoughts do not even occur to the individuals. So there is no chance of misbehavior, and therefore no chance of an unhappy people disabling one another. The same people who use freedom and cite personal responsibility as a reason for disabling their fellow man, they have come up with a workaround, which is, instead of tackling systemic inequities, their workaround is creating a culture of injury and harm, a punitive culture as a method of reform. This punitive reform measure ends up in disabling the body part of a victim instead of rehabilitating the victim accused of misbehavior. Specifically, instead of healing the misbehaving party and restoring the disabled entirely, one too many give them plastic and metal robotic prosthetics, sign language, and create an accessibility culture to accommodate harm to the victim, thereby sanctioning and legitimizing harm to the victim. Unfortunately, one too many create a subculture which attempts to stigmatize and mark the disabled as different, and sometimes they will go so far as to normalize disability. The solution, of course, is to make the disabled whole, to regrow their disabled limbs, to let the blind see and the deaf hear, and the disease be healed entirely and wholly and organically without prosthetics or electronic aids. Unfortunately, as mentioned earlier, one too many may use disability as they have since ancient times, as a way of controlling, manipulating, and incarcerating peoples. And it is used for similar purposes even today, unfortunately. Of course, a solution to such thinking is to educate the race harmer and the harmer that the way to reform ought to be through reform without doing harm. That is enshrined in modern and even ancient medical ethos, particularly the Hippocratic Oath, which advocates for reform without harm. Unfortunately, there is a hurdle to that. It requires a certain degree of generosity and charity. To heal and make whole is a generous and charitable act, as Pope Francis admitted. The concern is that if we engage in charity towards a person and they end up reproducing, people may have to then extend charity to the next generation, to more than one person now, particularly if the disease or disability is hereditary. Of course, the solution is that the healing of the disabled, even though it's viewed as a generous act by society, we may still engage in that. But society as a whole, both disabled and able, may ease the burdens of healing by voluntarily contributing to population management. That is, they avoid burdening the healers and the acts of generosity by engaging in a reciprocal selfless act by abstaining from reproduction and passing hereditary diseases and disability to the next generation. Now, if it seems that most of our concerns are related to population management, you would be fairly accurate, since it is one area with not as many direct controls or regulations and the root cause of many concerns in our world today. However, simply encouraging rehabilitation and population management may not be enough, since those who afflict disabilities may still argue that it is a means of reforming peoples and people themselves have not been reformed. For such people who would afflict suffering and disability upon others as a way of improving or reforming them, may we suggest this? May they know that the best method of reform is through loving kindness. Reform is best through a holy spirit and a holy environment, a holy interior and exterior. So even the thought of misbehavior does not occur to an individual, and the incentive to disable a misbehaving individual is removed. Now you may be noticing in slides mentioning systemic flaws and root causes throughout. We will go over some of these root causes and systemic flaws in the upcoming slides.